So in this section, I would like to introduce you to an objection to Bratman's theory of shared intention that arises from thinking about contralateral commitments. Let's take a step back first and have some background on commitment, and in particular, what is a contralateral commitment? Now, the easiest way to see this is by contrast with a personal commitment. So if I form an intention tonight to go to the cinema, that's in some sense involves a commitment to do so. Intentions involve some kind of commitment to action, but the commitment in question is one that is my commitment that I make. The thing committed is me, and the thing that the commitment is owed to is also to me. Right, so that would be characteristic of a personal commitment. It's by me, it's a commitment of me, what's committed I am. What's the commitment to? Me, right? A commitment to myself. By contrast, a contralateral commitment is the kind of commitment that might happen if I said to you, oh, hey, would you take me to the station later because I need to catch a train? And you said, yeah, sure, I'll definitely do that, right? I promise I will do that. So in making that promise to me, you are committing yourself. So the commitment is made by you and the commitment is of you, but the commitment is to me. So interestingly, in this case, I might say to you, look, actually, don't worry about it, I'll get a taxi. So I'm releasing you from the commitment that you have to me. That's a contralateral commitment. In the personal commitment case, nobody can release you from it but yourself. All right, very simple notion, not supposed to be difficult, even if the terminology is tough. Now, here's an observation about commitment, or a putative observation, as I might more carefully say. Margaret Gilbert says, if they're walking together, both Andrea herself and Heinrich will have the understandings that, by virtue of their walking together, Andrea has a right to Heinrich's continued walking alongside her, together with the standing to issue related rebukes and demands. So if Heinrich just goes and walks off in the other direction or just stops walking, apparently Andrea can rebuke him for doing that. Next piece of background information, this is the last one. A. Broth says that just having an intention, so Andrea intends to walk, or she intends that she and Heinrich walk, and Heinrich has the intention that she intends to walk, just having those intentions won't amount to having a commitment to anyone beside themselves, right? So you might understand that an intention carries a personal commitment. So if I have an intention that we walk, then I've got a personal commitment to our walking. It's hard to see how you get a contralateral commitment out of that. Good, all right. So there's the background, and perhaps you can anticipate what's coming. What we're looking for is an objection to Michael Bratman's account of shared intention based on this observation from Margaret Gilbert about commitment. So here, if you remember, is the substantive part of Bratman's account. Bratman says, look, for us to have a shared intention, it's sufficient, not necessary, but sufficient, that we each intend that we walk together, in accordance with and because of these intentions and matching subplans of them, and that this be common knowledge between us. And you know that later Bratman adds some further conditions, but they won't matter for the argument that we're presenting now. If you're really worried about this, you can check that for sure. Now here comes the objection, 4 steps. First of all, shared intentions are associated with contralateral commitments. That's the claim that we've just seen Margaret Gilbert make in the background, Heinrich and Andrea. Secondly, having the intention specified by Bratman's account would not entail having contralateral commitments, and nor would meeting any of the other conditions. Right? So this is the second premise in the objection. Third premise says, look, an account of shared intention has to explain the origin of these contralateral commitments. That's the requirement. It's got to be part of your theory of shared intention. It follows from that, here's the objection, that Bratman's account is at best incomplete. It might be wrong, or it might be that we have to supplement it with something which would explain the origin of these contralateral commitments. Very good. Now you might be thinking, look, this is kind of a weak objection. We're not really saying Bratman's view is wrong. We're saying, look, at the very we're just saying it's incomplete, right? It might be wrong, or it might be incomplete. The reason for that is that we're starting with a weak premise here. I'm just saying that shared intentions are associated with contralateral commitments. Now, Gilbert herself wants to make a much stronger claim, as you have seen, right? So Gilbert wants to say, look, in virtue of having the shared intention that we walk together, you have a right to rebuke me if we go away. So it's not just that they're associated, but we've got an in virtue of claim. And in that case, if you supported that stronger claim in the first premise, then you could derive a stronger conclusion here. But of course, the art of doing philosophy is to try to get by with the weakest premises you can. And my view is that we're going to have a hard time making even this weak version of the objection work. So I'm not going to consider a stronger objection yet. In fact, I'll get the best value for money here by considering the weakest possible objection, showing that that fails, and that will rule out any stronger objection from working. All right, so what should we say about this objection? Well, the first thing to consider is what happens if we accept it? So suppose we think that the objection is right, and suppose we think furthermore that it calls for an alternative kind of theory. Well, in that case, we might be motivated to consider Margaret Gilbert and her notion of joint commitment, which according to her underlies a whole host of central social phenomena and is also a precondition, she says, of the correct description of acting together and a shared intention, among other things. So if the objection is correct, we would certainly be motivated to consider Margaret Gilbert's theory about joint commitment and how you can build shared intention from joint commitment. Now, I have a bad conscience here because I'm introducing this term and I'm not explaining what joint commitment is. The reason for that is I think we should only consider this notion seriously on this course if the objection is clearly successful. I'm going to argue that the objection fails, and that's why I decided for the purposes of this course not to consider Margaret Gilbert's view directly, but that doesn't mean that you can't do that in working on this in your essays. I'm just not going to tell you much about it. All right, so here's the objection again. How might we respond to the objection on behalf of Bratman? Terribly important. If we've got a theory, we need an objection to it in order to see whether the theory really stands up to objections. If we've got an objection, we need to think about, well, let's try and take this from the perspective of the objectee, the thing being objected to. What kind of response might we make? I think there are several possibilities, but the most direct thing to do is to think about this one. Why should we accept that the account of shared intention has to explain the origin of contralateral commitments? Why not say, look, whatever association there is between shared intention and contralateral commitments, that's a further thing, right? Why should that be part of my theory? And on the face of it, that looks like a pretty good initial response. We need some argument before we can accept this premise. After all, if we don't resist at some point, we just end up trying to construct a theory of everything, and that's clearly wrong, right? We want the smallest possible things to build theories of. So what does Gilbert say in defense of this premise? Well, she says several things, but I think the key part is contained in this quote. She says, when people regard themselves as collectively intending to do something, that's to say, in Bratman's terms, doing it with a shared intention, they appear to understand that by virtue of the shared intention, and that alone, each party has the standing to demand conformity of the other parties. A joint commitment account, one like Gilbert's, respects this fact. Accounts that do not appeal to joint commitment, such as those of Michael Bratman and John Searle, are hard-pressed to do so. So this is interesting. This gives us, I think, the basis for the claim that an account of shared intention has to explain this fact. Now I want to pause and notice something about the writing here. So Gilbert is speaking quite loosely because she said hard-pressed to do so. Now I am certainly a fan of nuance, so I certainly believe that it's an important skill to be able to say this is what the argument actually shows and this is the limit of the argument. There are other things that it doesn't show. It's very rare to have something that's both interesting and conclusive. On the other hand, I discourage you strongly in your writing from using this kind of language, from saying somebody is hard-pressed or saying that there is a worry. Let your objections be objections. Let the replies to the objections do their work. Let your evaluation by all means be nuanced, but don't use language like a worry or hard-pressed, which kind of equivocates on whether or not there is genuinely an objection here or not. Right? This, I think, is something to avoid in your writing, because it's very unclear what we should take from this. Does this mean that we should reject the accounts, or does it mean that actually everything's fine and there isn't an objection at all? It's very hard to know, or something in between. What is there in between that? It's very hard to know. Let's keep it clear, let's keep it simple. All right, with that out of the way, what we've got to notice here is that Gilbert is making a very strong claim about what the people who are collectively intending to do actually understand about their own activity. She is saying that they understand this by virtue of the collective intention and that alone. Right? Now, If Gilbert is right, if that's true, we've got a very clear justification for this premise 3. An account of shared intention ought to explain that. On the other hand, this is a very strong claim. So let's just take a look at how Bratman replies to this line of argument. So Bratman's deeply interested in Gilbert's work, takes it terribly seriously, and has a good and lengthy discussion of it. Now, the core of that discussion is that Bratman thinks that we can give an account of shared intention that doesn't in itself tell us anything about commitments, and then we can give a further explanation, a social explanation for the commitments. And in essence, it goes like this. If I assure you of something or intentionally encourage you to rely on it, then you are in a special position to criticize it. And here we can look at Scanlon on reliance. Lots of things he said about reliance are going to apply in the shared intention case. Furthermore, right, when I form a shared intention with you, then I form an intention that we walk together in conditions of common knowledge. So I know that you know that I intend to walk together with you. So I'm setting you up to rely on me. So for that reason, presumably you would ordinarily be in a special position to criticize me. So Bratman suggests that the shared intention gets associated with contralateral commitments as a consequence of the fact that the shared intentions are sustained by assurance and such like. So this assurance that we have is connected to the need for us to have common knowledge of the intentions. It follows from this, of course, that contralateral commitments might not only be a consequence very often of the shared intention in conditions of common knowledge is going to create the conditions for reliance. It's also that in order for there to be common knowledge of our intentions, it might well be that we need contralateral commitments. There presumably are other ways in which you might know that I have certain intentions. Perhaps it's just manifestly in my interest to have those, and you know me in this situation to be a person who acts in a highly rational way. But there may be other cases where actually there are lots of tempting outside options. So rather than go walking with you, I would prefer to watch a football match. And so you might have, in this case, some serious doubts about whether or not I have any intention to walk with you at all. But if I make a commitment, if I promise to you that I will go for a walk with you, that may then raise the stakes and provide the kind of condition that enables us to have shared intention. So Bratman's idea is, look, Gilbert, you're right that there's an association between shared intention and commitment, but that arises in two ways, which are kind of extrinsic to the shared intention itself. The first way it arises is that where there is shared intention, there is common knowledge concerning my intentions, and so of course I have knowingly created conditions where you're likely to rely on me, and where that's the case, then of course there is a kind of contralateral commitment from me to you and the associated possibility of you criticizing me. Equally, there will be many cases where, absent a commitment on my part, it will be impossible for you to know what my intentions are, and therefore no possibility of common knowledge of our intentions, and therefore no possibility on Bratman's account of meeting those sufficient conditions for shared intention. So yes, says Bratman, these things are associated, but that's not part of shared intention. So you can see that Bratman is going to deny that it's by virtue of the shared intention and that alone that the commitments and entitlement to rebuke and all the rest of it arise. Bratman thinks that's actually a consequence of the shared intention together with some broadly ethical norms and some ordinary background facts about common situations rather than being intrinsic to the shared intention. Now, I'm not saying that Bratman's reply here is right or wrong, but what I do know is that we have a bit of a standoff. Gilbert says one thing, Bratman says the other. It's quite difficult to see why we might take one side or the other here. So what I want to suggest for now is not that Gilbert is wrong, but that this piece of reasoning on Gilbert's part does not by itself provide a sufficient reason to accept what she's saying, given the existence of an alternative. So let's summarise how these two thinkers differ. I'm going a bit slowly here, feel free to skip forwards. Luckily it's recorded. The question is, how is it that contralateral commitments are associated with shared intention? On the one hand, you have got Gilbert who says, Gilbert's over here. Gilbert who says the existence of contralateral commitments cannot be explained by general ethical and social facts because they're something that you get to in virtue of making the shared intention, right? So that means that there's something different from the ordinary run-of-the-mill ethical commitments that you have. So Gilbert. On the other hand, Bratman thinks that actually those contralateral commitments can be explained by general ethical and social facts. Bratman also thinks that not all shared intention involves contralateral commitment. So he thinks that there may be optimal cases where we do have a shared intention and so on, but there is actually no or very minimal contralateral commitments on our part, and certainly no possibility of one of us rebuking the other for failing to carry on. Those who are fans of Bratman will know that he seems to have actually changed his view slightly on this position between some of the earlier work and the 2014 book, and he has a lovely footnote there about some opera singers. So I want to be very careful here. I think that even in the later work, Bratman's view is that you don't absolutely have to have contralateral commitment to shared intention, but he certainly moved closer in later work to thinking that it's almost inevitable that there will be a contralateral commitment of some kind or another, explained by these general social and ethical facts. Gilbert, on the other hand, thinks that you cannot have shared intention without contralateral commitment. There is just no such thing. And then, of course, most strongly, Gilbert thinks that the commitment is just an intrinsic part of the shared intention, whereas Bratman thinks, no, the commitment is extrinsic to the shared intention. And what you notice here is that there's a cascade of claims. So even if Bratman accepts that commitment is extrinsic to shared intention, he might reject this one. So he might end up saying, look, it's always a consequence. It's always that you get shared intention and commitment, but this is still extrinsic. There's still some explanation of why the commitment and the shared intention go together, which isn't really internal to shared intention. I stress this because what we have to do to decide between Gilbert and Bratman is to decide which of these top claims is true. And that, I think, is something which is very difficult to do. It's very difficult to see even how we might go about doing that. So let's go back to the insight that we started with. Gilbert offers us a putative observation about Andrea and Heinrich. And she says, look, if they're walking together, then by virtue of walking together, performing that joint action, Andrea has a right to Heinrich's continued walking and the standing to issue rebukes and demands. And that, says Gilbert, is to be explained by the fact that walking together involves these commitments. But even people who are quite sympathetic to some of Gilbert's ideas about commitments generally might well want to be doubtful about this. I think Abe Roth puts it very well when he says, look, might you not have a non-committal attitude towards walking with someone? For example, if you suspect that the person might turn out to be irritable and unpleasant company. So you and I might decide, not really knowing each other, that we will go for a walk together and we will perhaps talk about a little bit of philosophy. But if it turns out that I start rattling off about Heidegger and you really want to talk about Sartre or something like that, then it would just be fine for us to go our separate ways. And each of us might have that in mind and we might anticipate that. So we might go for a walk together, anticipating that things will quickly fall apart. We will go our separate ways, and not necessarily even by mutual constraint. It would be totally fine for you to walk off and leave me in the middle of a sentence if you wish. That's just how you and I are choosing to live this part of our lives. It doesn't on the face of it seem that there would be anything obviously wrong with that. So it's hard to accept that what Gilbert is offering us here is an observation to be taken at face value. The problem, I think, is this. Gilbert offers one interesting and consistent set of views linking commitment and shared intention. We haven't shown that there's anything wrong with that. Bratman offers an alternative, internally consistent set of views about shared intention on which shared intention and commitment are not intrinsically related. Both of those views are internally coherent. Both of those views surely have something to be said for them on the basis of how people ordinarily act, but they're mutually incompatible. Now, Gilbert here is quite explicit about the methods. So when she's writing about the methods she used, she says, look, I'm relying on informal observation, including self-observation and my own sense of the matter. And presumably Bratman, to a large extent, is relying on the same. But if that's what each of those philosophers are doing, it's not necessarily very surprising that they come out with different conclusions. And indeed, you, if you rely on informal observation and your own sense of the matter, might well come to a different view from me. But at that point, we just end up stuck. There is not much that we can do about it. This is my sense of the matter. That's your sense of the matter. There must be more. There must be a way that we can go deeper here. There must be a deeper understanding that we can have of the relation between shared intention and commitment. One of the challenges here is how might we get such a thing? And it looks to me like this is a problem where taking it to the behavioural sciences might be helpful. But that's a further matter. For now, I want to leave you with the objection from commitment to Bratman's account. If you've been following this section, you should understand what the objection is, and you should understand what you will need to do to make it work. Among supporting the other two premises, you're certainly going to have to say something convincing about premise 3, and you're going to have to do a better job of supporting it, either by using the resources that Gilbert provides. I wasn't able to find a strong support for this premise, or from some other route in order to sustain it. Alternatively, you might think that Bratman's account is not susceptible to the objection from contralateral commitment, and in that case you might be in the market for an alternative objection to Bratman's account.